All right, so we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about what the election results mean for the state of giving in 2025. The election was only about a month and a week ago, and yet it feels quite far. Um, so we're going to dive in there, but please keep sharing all the things that are making you all happy, and we'll go from there. All right, so some quick notes. Quick note. Oh, the holdovers sounds good too. So if you have favorite Christmas movies besides the classics that most people will have seen, please put some recs in the chat. Would love to know it. Miracle on 34th Street, 1947 version is, I think, the second best after It's a Wonderful Life, which is probably the best. But let me know if you have other things. Die Hard is up there, but It's a Wonderful Life is better than Die Hard, and I will die on that hill. Okay, quick note here. CFRE approved for 1.0 credits, as you might have guessed. We have added a question to a survey at the end of the session to get so just make a note in that survey if you don't mind, so please do that. Here's the agenda. We'll do some intros. We'll talk very quickly about the 2024 election results and what they mean, by the way, for the 2026 election results, which you haven't even bothered to think about yet. We'll do a look back on both the previous Trump administration and charitable giving results in other election years, what that means, what it's likely to mean for 2024, what it's likely to mean for 2025. And then we'll sort of talk about the economic landscape, how that fits in, and we'll give you some extremely practical tips on top of what Christmas movie you should watch this week. So Holiday Inn, ooh, good shout out. Bells of St. Mary's, also quite good. And the original animated Grinch, right? Not the Jim Carrey one, which is a little weird, but the original one is very good. Okay, so my name is Patrick. I'm lucky to be the co-CEO and co-founder of FreeWill alongside my wonderful friend Jenny. I'm in New York City. Jenny's all the way out in the Seattle area. So if you see her on the street in Seattle, say hi and Merry Christmas to her. We are lucky to be the co-founders of FreeWill, as I mentioned. FreeWill, if you haven't heard, is the #1 estate planning and #1 plan giving solution in the United States, now trusted by more than 1,800 nonprofits, featured in things like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, AARP, and some of these very famous organizations you see at the bottom, and very small organizations that you haven't heard of. We get to work with all of them, and we're very happy to do it. We get to a team of what is now about 240 people, which is crazy, 230 maybe, but we're growing quickly, and that is really fun. Team is on 3 continents now, which is also crazy. North America, obviously, South America, and Asia. Okay, other things we're doing as we're rolling into the new year sooner rather than later. We are sending this as a holiday gift to 20 people on the call. At the end of the session, drop your name and your address in the survey. What is this book? It's a book called The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday and Stephen Hanselman. Ryan is the best-selling author of The Obstacle is the Way. It's about stoicism, but it is an extremely practical daily reading. You don't have to read it every day, but every day you read it, I promise you it will make your day better. Justin says it's an awesome book. Megan says it's a great book. Susan says she's been reading this 1 page a day every year, which is very impressive, but I love it. And so you'll have a January 1 reading and a January 2 reading and so on and so forth. Each reading is about 3 paragraphs. You could read it in just a few moments, but it's quite useful. Carrie says she's in the midst of raising teens, and so it's incredibly useful. Phoebe, let's make sure that Carrie gets a copy of the book. So make a note in the survey if you'd like a chance to get a copy and tell us where to send it. So please do that in the survey, not in the chat. Thank you very much. And we'll go from there. Okay, we're going to keep diving in here. We asked you how your week was going, and what we heard is, a little bit of a dip in happiness. We're starting to hit some stress. There's a bunch of different things happening in the world, so we'll name that, but not too low. And then more importantly, at least for this context, we continue to see very strong end-of-year results. And so people's confidence in hitting their goals this year is staying steady from last time's high point. And many of you reported having a very strong Giving Tuesday. And Giving Tuesday, the organization reported having a very strong Giving Tuesday. And that is a good sign for giving across the board. Now, we knew, and if you have been coming to this, we projected a very strong Giving Tuesday and a very strong end of year, which is what's likely to happen. But we're going to look now and say, okay, great. Well, how is the election results? And particularly compared to the alternate reality where Kamala wins and Democrats potentially control the House and or the Senate, what does this mean we'll talk about the election results just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Again, apologies, this is going to be relatively US focused. I know that Canada is going through its own political challenges right now, as are many places around the country, around the world. So what happened, as many of you know, Republicans have won all three branches of government, flipping the Senate and the presidency from Democratic control and maintaining control of the House of Representatives. You probably have guessed that President Trump has been reelected as the 47th president of the United States, only the second president to be reelected to non-consecutive terms after our dear friend Grover Cleveland. The House of Representatives is an extremely slim Republican majority with a 2020 to 2015 split, but soon to be 2017 to 2015 because three members of Congress have been appointed to roles in the administration and are likely to resign shortly. And that means that if one Republican splits, you no longer have a majority, or one Republican flips, but those three will go to special election likely, and most of those will probably be held by Republicans. So going back to 2020 to 2015. And the Senate also flipped and grew a majority to 53 to 47. This marks the first time that Republicans have been holding all three branches of government since 2016, which then expired in 2018 when Democrats took back control of the House. So House of Representatives in 2025 looks like this. Lots of red, land, more rural areas tend to be more Republican, and therefore these maps always lean very Republican, when in fact we're pretty close to a 50-50 country. Sworn in on January 3rd, Democrats hold 2015, as we mentioned, and a majority of 2018 to control the chamber. In fact, Democrats gained one seat from where they went into in the election. Republicans lost one. So it's even more interesting there. Republicans flipped the Senate. 50-seat majority is needed in the Senate if you hold control of the White House, because the vice president is the deciding vote. And the 2025 Senate will consist of roughly 47 Democrats and 53 Republicans. Now, in actuality, it's 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents. Agus, I actually don't know how to pronounce it, sorry. King in Maine and Bernie Sanders in Vermont are technically independents, but they caucus with the Democrats, and so we're counting those. Democrats lost 4 seats. Republican gained 4 seats. So this is a really big shift in the Senate, and we'll talk more about what that means in a moment. But Montana, Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania flip from blue to red. Now, Montana and West Virginia are particularly interesting for this case because they will have downstream effects for a long time to come. Montana and West Virginia were held for a relatively long amount of time by Democrats in relatively conservative states. And so Democrats are unlikely to be competitive in those states in the near term. Montana, John Tester won in 2006 in an upset. I'm actually not sure when Joe Manchin won. So if anyone has that, feel free to enter in the chat. The new Senate will be sworn in on January 3rd, 2025. Oh, great. Wyan says, Republicans don't control all 3 branches of government. They control 2 branches, which is correct. The Supreme Court is the 3rd. And yet, all 3 sort of are both parts of the legislature and the presidency. Thank you very much. Governor's races, really interesting outcomes in the governor's races. In an anti-incumbent environment, 11 governorships were on the ballot this election, and these are the ballots. This is what was on the ballot. In every state, the party that held power in the governorship kept it, right? So you have some thematic elements of anti-incumbency this year, and yet no flips at all of the gubernatorial races. There is a near even split between the 2 parties, 27-23 favoring the Republicans. So what do we expect in 2026? So obviously most of you know 2024, but we use it to start informing 2026. And this is obviously best guesses. No one can predict it. But if I were a betting man, which I am not, I would expect 2 things to happen. I would expect reversion to Democratic control of the House of Representatives for 2 reasons. First is that historically, the president's party typically loses seats in the first midterm election. This has been true in most cases in recent times, with the exception of 2002, I believe, which came right after 9/11 and historically high approval ratings for then President Bush. And one of the really interesting things is that historically, especially over the last 50 years, Republicans have outperformed in what we call off-year elections, meaning non-presidential year elections and special elections, et cetera, when fewer people vote. And what's happening is you're seeing this shift where college-educated voters, older voters, wealthier voters, all of whom for the long time were the backbone of the Republican Party's voter base, have now shifted to be more of the Democrats. And so you have high information voters voting more Democrat, low information voters voting more Republican. No judgment on either of those, but it means that in off-year elections, you're likely to see Democratic overperformance. And then in presidential years, you're likely to see Republican overperformance, at least compared to off years. So that's what we might expect to see in the House. Now, Republicans are likely to hold the Senate with only 3 potentially Republican-held competitive seats, which again only gets you to 50-50 when J.D. Vance is still the deciding vote. North Carolina, which is a relatively purplish state, Maine, which is a blue state, but Susan Collins has done a good job holding on to that seat historically, and Ohio, which is not up for Senate races in 2026 historically. It's not on that sort of 6-year cycle, but there will be a special election to fill J.D. Vance's seat, which he is obviously resigning to become vice president. And there's a world where Ohio would normally not be competitive, but the gentleman who lost his seat in 2024, Senator Sherrod Brown, is potentially likely to run again. And if he runs, he at least has a fighting chance of taking that seat. And yet, if Democrats swept all those 3 seats, they would remain at 50-50, and J.D. Vance again would be the tie-breaking vote. But with the House potentially switching, and I think likely to switch in 2026, it means the bulk of the legislative activity that we will see will happen in the next 2 years. So keep an eye on that. The next 2 years are going to be the bulk of the legislative activity of the next 4 years. Now, if Republicans hold all 3 branches, excuse me, not branches, or if they hold the House, the Senate, and the presidency in 2026, you will see obviously continued legislative activity there. Okay, so let's rewind to the first Trump administration and take a look at, it's one of the rare times where a new president comes in and we actually have evidence of what happened last time. So 2016 was the last time Republicans held a trifecta, as we mentioned, in control of the White House, Senate, and the House. And obviously, it made it easier for Trump administration to implement policy. Excuse me. Big things that happened: tax reform, judicial appointments, and an increase in workforce development were major themes that impacted the nonprofit sector. Excuse me. Now, giving before Trump in 2014 was $390 billion. This achieved a 60-year high for charitable giving. 2015, another high, 411. Continued growth fueled by individual giving, the rise of individual giving. 26, 427 billion. Third consecutive year of record-breaking giving, right? So we're really interesting to see that. You can see here, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, you saw giving continue to go up. So very positive trends going into the administration. Again, 2017, 453 billion. Individual and foundation giving were key contributors to this growth. So we saw a lot of things happening there. 2018 was the first time in a long time we saw a dip, down 1.7% year over year. Giving by individuals in particular decreased by 3.4% in 2018. Now, some of you know what took place in 2018. Feel free to put it in the chat, but we will talk about that in a moment. So what the heck happened in 2018? We'll come back to that. In 2019, a slight increase, and in 2020, pandemic time, slight increase again. Individual, foundation, and bequest giving all increased in 2020. You can see here overall charitable giving, you see that dip and general trends going up and to the right, but it's not all good news, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So we look at previous charitable giving in previous election years. We also have historical trends that we can learn from. And what happens in post-election giving? Well, you see increase in contributions to organizations aligned with the losing party, and a small decrease in giving aligned with the winning party. This 58% increase, by the way, happens when it's a very surprise result. On the regular, it's a slight increase to the winning party. So that 58 increases in surprise results. This election, not quite a surprise, certainly not the level of 2016, but a mild surprise to some. The election's impact on charitable giving is significantly larger, as we mentioned, when the result is unexpected. And for non-aligned and apolitical organizations, there's a slight decrease, very slight, don't worry about it too much, in this calendar year. In left and right-leaning counties, in election years. The more Republican a county is, the more residents give to charity on average. This is because the more Republican a county is, it often results in, or it correlates with increased religiosity. But Republican donors give less in Democratic-leaning counties, which is interesting. And residents of Democratic-leaning counties, of course, give less if Republican-leaning counties give more. But in part because Democratic-leaning counties often have higher taxes and donations, more money is given overall to causes, in part because some of that money is funneled through the government and the state and local governments. When counties are divided, interestingly, both donations and taxes go down. One explanation for that might be a little bit lower trust overall. So there's some interesting things to happen there. Again, we're looking back at 2016 because we have some historical precedent to understand what's going to happen. You can see that giving by individuals increased by 2.6%. Giving also shifted to liberal-aligned nonprofits. Many called this the Trump bump. Helpful rhyme. Some liberal-aligned nonprofits experienced a 155% boost in giving. This is now referred to as rage giving. This is all from Blackbaud. Thank you for the research there. Rage giving in 2016, for instance, 300,000 new members of the ACLU, a 50 times increase in post-election giving to the Anti-Defamation League compared to previously, increased giving to women's rights groups. Online giving was paramount to the rage giving boost. In one weekend, the ACLU raised $24 million in online donations following the Trump administration's controversial travel ban from Muslim countries that some of you remember. And for impacted nonprofits, the Trump term may present new opportunities for fundraising so long as your org has the processes in place to steward and accept these gifts. Our expectation, because this is less of a surprise in 2016, is that this bump will not happen to the same degree, but there will be some. When we look at Election Day 2016 and the weeks coming after, you can see how much larger giving was, especially among women, but across the board as well. By the way, none of this is about explicitly partisan organizations. They're just sort of more democratic, or they're sort of more liberal or conservative leaning is the right way to think about it. You can see how massive this was for the ACLU in particular. Huge spike in 2017, right? End of year giving into all of 2017, 2018, 2019, slow decreases, but big jumps above our baseline for 2014, 2015, and 2016. And then, okay, what happened in 2020, which was the last election year, as you might imagine? Overall giving went up by about 4%. Now, this was compounded by a global pandemic, as you remember. Keep in mind that there were many factors at play, among them mass protests and giving to racial justice organizations and the presidential election. So 2020 is sort of a year that is interesting, but not helpful because there are so many confounding variables there to inform our previous work. In 2020, contributions from individuals, foundations, and bequests all saw increases. Corporate giving experienced a decline, in part because a lot of corporations were in panic about the pandemic. And much of this increase in giving is attributed to COVID-19. Again, difficult to determine the influence of the presidential election on that. Okay, but the most important thing, and this is, I think, not widely enough understood. People sort of get it, but we really want to dive into the major legislative happening under the first Trump administration, which affected charitable giving in an enormous way. And if we are being responsible stewards of our organization, what are we going to do? We're going to really internalize the lessons of that and then shift our strategy going forward. So this is, if you've just been having fun and looking at the Christmas movies, make sure you write them all down so you actually go watch them because they're going to be great. But also pay attention to this section in particular. So we're going to understand the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, many of you are not that excited about tax legislation, which is fair, but just get excited about it for a few minutes because this is really important as it comes to philanthropic strategy. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, aka the TCJA, which we'll call it sometimes in the future, passed in 2017 and went into effect in 2018, right? So it passed the last time there was a Republican trifecta, and it went into effect the following year. What did it do? It doubled the standard tax deduction for tax years of 2018 to 2025. Double the standard deduction from about $10,000 to about $20,000 for a married couple. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act limited itemized deductions for state and local taxes. We call them SALT taxes. What are these? It means if you got a lot of property taxes or you have a lot of state taxes to 10K per year, right? And again, blue states tend to have higher taxes on average. So this hurt folks in blue states more than red states, but it did hurt everybody across the board. Hurt's not the right word. affected because we have the double the standard tax deduction as well. And it also capped the mortgage interest deduction. So what does that mean, right? Historically, let's just talk about deductions. It's going to be a little wonky, but there's basically two types of deductions. There's a standard deduction, which is everybody gets, no matter what you do. You don't have to have a mortgage. You don't have to have state taxes. You don't have to give anything in charity. You get this deduction just for being a taxpayer. Now, there's itemized deductions, which is we start capping, we start, adding up the things that we're itemizing. And if it gets above the standard deduction, then we're what we call itemizers. We do all the itemizing. And if we get above that, then that's our deduction instead of the standard deduction. So what the heck happened in 2018? Oh, one other point that's important, just to understand the mortgages. So for mortgages taken out before December 15th, 2017, interest is deductible for up to $750K. Sorry, that is the new rule. That's the new rule under Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So only your first $750,000 of mortgage debt is applicable. Now, that's a big house in many places, but if you're in a New York suburb, a Boston suburb, an SF suburb, et cetera, it's not a big house, and a lot of the houses become more expensive. So the result here is that under this legislation, most taxpayers get bigger tax breaks from the standard deduction than from itemizing deductions. Why do we care about that? Because itemizing deductions includes charitable contributions. So the result is that 9 or 10% of Americans now, and this is true starting 2018, itemized deductions down from 30% back in 2017. Huge, 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 right? A big, big shift here. A new study by Indiana University and the University of Notre Dame, not the church that just reopened, found that charitable giving fell by $16 billion annually in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act first year of implementation, right? $16 billion drop in giving from what would have happened had this not gone into effect. So to get a little bit a finer point in this, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is the largest change in U.S. tax policy in a generation. And our research shows that it had a large effect on charitable giving. Otoni Wilhelm said, this is the researcher, among households that had previously been itemizing but switched to taking the standard deduction in 2018, the amount they gave to charity decreased by an average of $880. So what do we mean here? We mean that the entirety of that decline, the entirety of that $16 billion decline annually, $20 billion in 2018, but then $16 billion annually, every year sort of falls out of charitable giving. And every single dollar of that comes from a decrease in giving from non-itemizers who are mostly small dollar donors. Just to give you a sense here, you can see the shift in itemizing to not itemizing. Top 1%, let's look from right to left. So top 1%, relatively small, 95th to 99th percentile, even there a meaningful shift into non-itemizing. 90th to 95th percentile, 80th to 90th, we start to see big shifts. So you can be making 80%, you can make more money than 80% of Americans, and your chances of itemizing dropped in half by this law. This fourth quintile, which means you're already in the top 25% of income earners, right? That's what the fourth quintile means. You see you're dropping by 2/3, middle quintile dropping by 3/4, second quintile dropping by 3/4 again, and the lowest quintile is mostly not itemizing either way. Okay, so let's look at this for a moment. What does it mean is that everybody below the 90th percentile of income is actually really shifting away from itemizing deductions, and that's a huge drop. So what is this going to mean going forward? This is a really big deal. So really try to internalize this. What it means under another Trump administration is that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which are set to expire in 2025. So if you imagine a Harris victory and maybe a Democratic Senate, that would have expired in 2025. But instead, we would expect it to be extended for another 7 years, which is what it was for the first time. Now, there may be some shifts, but generally this feels like the thing that is most likely to happen. So for another 7 to 8 years, what we're seeing is a continuation of these tax policies. And it means that we should see an ongoing decrease in small dollar donations, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, because of the lack of itemizations. Now, if you're a small dollar taxpayer, this could be better for you, right? It may be that you're paying less in taxes and you're fine with it, but from a charitable giving standpoint, it's less incentivized, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So we need to be thinking strategically. We need to say, okay, this is likely to happen. And so we should be focusing on those folks that are itemizing, and we should be looking for other avenues to give tax benefits to donors that might not see it otherwise. So we're looking at, and then planned giving, which we'll talk about in a second, is going to be the way to generate enormous funds from small dollar donors, more than sort of chalking up these $50 donations one at a time. This is especially true through tax smart channels like stocks and donor advised fund gifts. And a key strategic takeaway, so you can write this down if you need to think about when we think about 2025, we're going to invest less in small dollar giving and more in areas of transformational giving, because that is the most likely path to actually hitting your goals. So, all right, before we go into more practical outcomes here, we're going to internalize that the legislative environment is conducive to major and planned giving, and it is not conducive to small dollar giving, and that is likely to be true for the next 7 to 8 years, right? Beth says ongoing inflation isn't helping with small dollar giving either. That is true, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So what's happening in the economic landscape? So a couple of things have happened, in part because of the election, and in part just happens to be concurrent with the election, but it's very, very much going to shape your 2024 and 2025 giving. So the good news for charitable giving is that the economy is booming from an assets perspective. First, we'll talk about crypto, and then we'll talk about the stock market. So crypto is booming. Bitcoin, most popular cryptocurrency in the world, has appreciated over 140% since the election. Excuse me, 140% in the year, and 50% since the election. 2 years ago, Bitcoin had dropped below 17,000. On election day, it was 69,000, and as of December 5th, it hit 100,000 for the first time. Now, a lot of you say, well, we don't love Bitcoin. It has some serious environmental impact, which is true. It's true. Ethereum, the second largest crypto coin behind Bitcoin, is also on the rise. And interestingly, in the United States, more people donate Ethereum, and Ethereum is donated in larger quantities than Bitcoin. Ethereum is very much used in the United States. Bitcoin is very much more used outside the United States. Now, one of the things about Ethereum that you might not know is that as of 2022, it has virtually no climate impact at all, and certainly has even less than a credit card donation in terms of electricity used. So that's a big shift from Bitcoin. And so generally, you should feel enthusiastic about getting Ethereum donations. And it eliminates energy consumption by 99% overnight. And that price is 4,000. Now, these are all sort of different currencies, and so it's not as though these are sort of mapping one-to-one, but that 4,000 is an all-time high as well, and very exciting for Ethereum owners. Now, why is crypto on the rise, right? We don't like to just tell you things that have happened without explaining why it happened. So Trump's victory has been a major catalyst for the crypto market's growth. He has pledged to make U.S., quote, the crypto capital of the planet. The point of crypto is that there's no capital of it, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. The market is expecting a more lenient regulatory environment under Trump and a potential reversal of the SEC's enforcement-heavy approach towards crypto, which might mean more investment of crypto by institutional investors. What it means for nonprofits is that regardless of your personal views on crypto, there is a fast-growing opportunity on crypto philanthropy. In fact, approximately 580 million crypto users worldwide, up 34% from 2023. Roughly 1 in every 6 humans in the world owns crypto. Over $2 billion has been given to nonprofits and crypto donations. And so far in Q4, crypto gifts are 7 times higher than they were a year ago. So this is a really big deal. Really interesting stuff. Setting that aside, a much more important version of economic growth is in the stock market, at least when it comes to charitable giving. So crypto giving is nice. You should be open to it. Stock market giving is going to affect the giving of every one of your organizations. We've seen a 5% surge after the year, following a very strong year across the board. The S&P 500 is up 28% year to date. This is an enormous gain. So good for your 401ks and good for your charitable giving. It is the third best year of the last 25. Okay, so this is one of the strongest economic performance years we've had in a long time. And our internal data, which we're sharing for the first time here, is showing a dramatic rise in the number and total dollar amount of stock gifts compared to the same period in 2023. And so we're seeing a lot more gifts flow to nonprofits. Now, a strong stock market is good news for charitable giving because A, it makes people feel more wealthy, and B, it affects all of these asset-based gifts. So remember that several types of giving are primarily invested in mutual and index funds. Obviously, stock giving, so stock giving is up. Qualified charitable distributions from IRAs. What are these? These are gifts from your IRA from donors over 70.5. These are going up because most of that money is held in mutual funds. So those mutual funds are growing, which means more QCD giving. Now, donor advised funds are mostly invested in mutual funds as well, mutual and index funds. So the money in donor advised funds, even without more people putting money in, is rising dramatically. Okay, so all of the money invested in sitting in donor advised funds is usually invested. It's not just hanging out there like a checking account. And so even with nothing else happening, that money grows by, say, 20% this year, on top of more people having a lot of wealth. So they're putting more money into donor advised funds. In our internal data, again, shared for the first time, is showing a dramatic rise in the number in total of QCDs and donor advised funds this year. Sorry, there's a lot to talk about. But we're seeing huge shifts in this, and we're seeing an overall real transition of donors into giving these types of gifts, which has been sped up by the tax rules and sped up by the markets. So when we think about adopting to our new future, right? So now, okay, we have a new administration. We're likely to see a continuation of the tax regime that has shifted charitable giving. We're seeing extremely strong market performance in a couple areas. What the heck does this all mean? It actually means some pretty profound things for the next 5 to 10 years of charitable giving. So, no one gets to just sit here and wish things were the way they were in the 60s, right? We're clear-eyed about the future of giving in America. Most organizations, not all, but most organizations on average will see a continuous slow decline in small dollar cash giving over the next 8 years. And yet, many organizations are going to continue to grow, especially those that are able to adapt. There are 4 areas of strategic shifts in the new era that we should be thinking about as we structure our 2025 planning. And we'll walk through these. One is what I just said. We're reducing focus on small dollar donations, but not necessarily small dollar donors. It is just simply the case that if your goal, with a couple of exceptions here, right now, this isn't true for everybody, but it's going to be true for most organizations, that if you think we're going to rack up $75 gifts and that's going to help us hit our organizational goals, you are almost certainly wrong and planning for failure, right? I don't mean to be too blunt about it, but I just want to make sure that we save you from the future where you think, I'm just going to keep getting more $40 donations, and that's going to fund my mission. Instead, we're going to be maximizing giving from major donors who are more likely to itemize, and we're going to maximize the areas that are most tax advantaged for these donors. What we see is that when we can change the way that people give, that's when we can take a $3,000 donor and turn them into a $30,000 donor. And we're also going to try to turn small dollar donors into major givers through changing gift types and expanding planned giving. So planned giving is the way that any small dollar donor is going to make a several $100,000 or several $1,000,000 gift. And in the near term, those folks are going to give thousands or tens of thousands because we can change the way they give, right? So at its core, unless you have 10 million people on your email list, these $50 donations, right? Wikipedia is an exception here. But for the most part, these $50 donations are not going to move the needle for you in a big, big way. And also, we want to continuously grow our grant funding. So one of the things that happens, we'll talk more about this in a second, but one of the things that happens in an election with governmental shifts is that there are new opportunities in government funding. There are some opportunities slipping away, and there are new opportunities in foundation funding that are filling the gaps there. So we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so let's dive into small dollar donors because this is a really important point before we get off of it. Some people say, oh, people just aren't as invested in America as they used to be, something else. It's more complicated than that. Cash donations used to offer tax benefits. For 90% of people, they no longer do, right? So 9 out of 10 people receive no tax benefits for a cash donation. Now, some of you already have your direct mail set up for end of year, and it says make a tax-deductible donation of $80 to the Sierra Club, or whatever it may be. And for 9 out of 10 people, they say that's not true, right? They're not going to actually get a tax benefit. And so cash donations have become more expensive than they used to be for the average person who does not itemize their taxes, which is now a larger number of people. So let's put this in perspective. In 2010, let's pretend I'm making $80,000 a year. I don't think I was making $80,000 a year in 2010, but a $100 gift would have cost me $75 because I would have gotten that tax benefit from it. And so it's cheaper to give $100 than it is now. Now, making $80,000 again, it costs me a full $100 to make that gift. And so it's actually become 33% more expensive to donate to your organization than it used to be. And no wonder we're seeing a big drop. And some folks mentioned in the chat, inflation has hit these folks hard, especially for retirees who aren't getting corresponding wage increases that are keeping up with inflation. So suddenly, as I think about, wow, everything's expensive, am I making an even more expensive charitable gift? Even if I'm spending the same amount of money, even if I still say, yeah, I'll give $75, that's dropped my giving by a quarter. So the fact that it's only down by, 16 billion is actually sort of impressive because it's costing everybody more to make this gifts. Does this apply to religious organizations as well? We do think that small cash donations will continue to decrease at religious organizations. But one of the things is that as giving to religious organizations decreases, in part because there is just less church attendance and less synagogue attendance, less mosque attendance compared to previous generations, fewer people get in the habit of giving early compared to what they used to. Now, I think I've shared this example with some of you in the past, but when I was growing up, we went to a fun Roman Catholic church in the great town of Glen Rock, New Jersey, in Bergen County, for those of you that know it. That's a commuter town of New York City. And starting at the age of 5, I got an allowance. My allowance, I was super rich back then. I got a 45-cent allowance, and 10 cents of that had to go to church, right? Or later, 10 cents had to go to a different charity, whatever it would be. But that was the rules in the house. And so we got into the practice, even if folks are just giving to the church or the synagogue, you get into the habit of like giving on a weekly basis. And so it builds up. And then when the Sierra Club comes knocking, or my college comes knocking, or the local Boys and Girls Club comes knocking, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm like a person who's been giving for 20 years. And in the absence of that, for a lot of folks, you just don't get those training wheels that a lot of folks have had. And so you're starting to see that slip a little bit. And it's also affecting secular organizations in a way that they don't always think about. Okay, so what the heck are we going to do about it, right? Is all hope lost? In fact, no, most organizations who are taking the right steps are going to see sharp increases in giving over the next 5 years. So first things first, $250 billion is sitting in donor advised funds, and it is ripe to be asked for. We estimate that $65 to $70 billion is going to come out in DAF grants in 2024 and potentially even more in 2025. Our internal data, again, shows massive growth in DAF giving this year, so that's good news, and that is likely to continue in 2025. DAF payout rates under both Biden and Trump exceeded 20%, so $250 billion minimum, 55 billion coming out, probably much more, so that's a big deal. And the TCJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, popularized batching. What the heck is batching? Batching is when you give a bunch of money at once to get above the standard deduction 1 year, and then maybe don't give 2 and 3. And so DAFs have actually become a really popular method for batching because I can put all that money in now, I can give a third of it out now, a third of it out next year, and a third of it out the following year. So you start to see that as well. We need to be asking for donor advised funds in all of your giving solicitations. I mean, just imagine this, $70 billion is coming out in DAF grants. What's the total individual giving this year going to be? 350, 360. So 1 in every 5 or 1 in every $6 is going to be out of a DAF. Let's make sure we're asking for that. We are supporting donors in tax-smart ways to give in the absence of traditional deductions. And so we want to make sure that we're asking for things like gifts of stock, obviously. Again, these gifts are going to be going way up with the market as it is. Donor advised fund gifts, crypto. Crypto is the least important of the 4 that I'm showing you, but it's still helpful to have. And qualified charitable distributions, which is an incredibly fast-growing way of giving for older folks. Be ready and ask for these gifts. Number 1 rule of fundraising is you don't get what you don't ask for. And it kills me when folks don't ask for the larger gifts and instead just ask for $30, which frankly is not going to move the needle in most places. You should already be prepared as we approach end of year, but if not, make sure you are just including a note in every email you send to say, please give some of these gifts. There's a bunch of templates on our website that can help you out here. This year end is already set to outperform 2023, both in number of gifts and dollars raised, which is great news. Your team should be figuring out how to drive non-cash giving in order to drive your overall success. Just to give you an idea, typically we see about half of all Q4 giving coming in December. And what we've already raised, seen 90% of what was given in 2023, and we haven't even started most of September, right? So huge, huge, huge jumps. Susan says, and I think this is an important point, I understand and agree that 75 gifts aren't going to make our overall goals, but they're important to pipeline development. So this is an important point. Cash donations are, this is sort of the minor leagues, and we're looking to draft people into the major leagues, but it's not an end in itself. So it's a very important point. Thank you for calling that out. Great, great point. There is a ton of momentum going to year end, and there is a ton of momentum going to 2025 on these non-cash gifts. So do not wait to take advantage. Please, please, please. Even if you're already everything's set in stone for end of year, which we understand, get ready in 2025 to take these as well. Other big things, legacy pipeline really matters. So demographic trends and asset growth create an incredibly bullish outlook for plan giving. If you're not on the plan giving train, get on it. If you're on it, think about speeding it up. Boomers are entering their prime estate planning years. The older boomers are almost 80 years old. Largest and most prosperous generation in the history of the world is approaching 80. Youngest boomers are retirement age. 84 trillion is the updated expected transfer between now and 2045. So there is so much money sitting here. 84 trillion is more than it's like 1.8 times the entire US stock market. It's enormous. And it could be charitable giving if we ask for it. And this could go up if asset prices continue to appreciate, which we see some signs that it does. This could be the largest source of giving among small dollar donors over the next 10 years. What do we mean by that? We mean that plan giving is going to outpace all of these small dollar donor, all small cash giving combined. And someone that's giving you $30 a month right now could give you $450,000 in a planned gift. And that is what can help you hit your goals. And that's what can be transformational for the organization. So keep an eye on that as well. And then what happens, right, is that we've doubled the estate tax threshold. And so what it means is the historical path to leaning on a couple of big estates is not as smart as trying to have a much broader, more democratized approach to planned giving. We can get a whole bunch of these to generate a lot of money. And by the way, this will create more predictable sustainability than a very spiky set of small number of large gifts. So really, really important. Also, we'd be remiss to not talk about foundations. So foundation assets, right? A lot of foundation assets are invested in the stock market. So foundations have more money than they expected to have at the end of this calendar year. Why? Because the investments that they have are going up and up and up. So the assets reached a record high of 1.5 trillion. They grew at an annualized average rate of 8.3%, so continuing to grow. And $100 billion was given out in 2023, the equivalent to about a third of all individual giving. DAF charitable assets amount to less than 1/5 of private foundation asks. So if we think about DAFs, we also need to think about private foundations, which with much more money. And by law, they have to give out at least 5%. In most cases, they give out more, but super important. What happened in 2016 about foundations? Well, a lot of these folks increased their funding in response to Trump era policies. So what we want to do is now foundations are rethinking their strategy. If you're used to going to the same 4 or 5 foundations, let's spread our wings a little bit and start applying to 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 more this year. Even if you don't win all of those, we really need to start stretching our efforts in terms of getting new funding. So making this a priority early, right? March is one of the biggest granting times, one of the biggest deadlines for grant applications. So end of year is a little crazy. January, get on it, right? Start thinking about applying for more of these grants as early as January. So please, please, please do this. Not only should we be applying to more grants, but we should also adapt our grant proposals to shifting policies at the federal level, those of you that are doing government grants. So under the previous Trump administration, there was an emphasis on workforce development, vocational training, self-sufficiency programs, and in many cases, job readiness, skill building, small business growth, et cetera. If you're doing any of this work, start applying for more grants right now and get ready to apply for some federal grants. There may be expanded support for faith-based organizations, community service, social programs, et cetera. So get ready. If you're a faith-based organization and you're not doing a lot of grants, you might want to poke around on that as well. Some bonus tips as we wrap up. We're going to go through this very quickly because we're almost out of time, but we're going to segment rate donors. So if some people don't give that often, but at key moments, right? There are going to be some things. If you're a liberal leaning organization, I'm just going to promise you now that there are going to be some moments in Trump administration where all your donors get fired up and angry, right? It's going to happen. Um, be ready. And at that moment, make sure they're ready to give these larger gifts and not just a $50 gift, right? So this is very, very important. Even things like volunteering, right, could be a way to bring them in closer to the organization. Second, website's got to be ready for these big moments, right? You are not going to have, those of the ACLU, for instance, didn't have a second to plan for the travel ban. And so you want to be ready in advance of these moments. And that means making sure your website's ready, that it's accessible, that you have these other types of giving so that people can give you the big gifts. Some people are going to want to empty their donor advised funds at a moment's notice if they're really fired up, et cetera, et cetera. Keep the ways to give page updated with current tax info. Be ready for potential changes. Some of you already have planned giving microsites or smart giving microsites through FreeWill. If not, those will all be updated at a moment's notice. We are on it. We're paying attention to the legislation. So check that out. Okay, a couple of resources before we wrap up. One, my colleague Phoebe, thank you so much. I'm going to pause the chat for a second so everyone can see that link in the chat right now. First thing in the survey, coming back to, and there was a ton of information in a short amount of time. It's going to be a fun year. One thing that will make the year a little bit better is having this book, The Daily Stoic. So we're giving this to 20 people as a holiday gift. Check it out, read it, make sure it happens, and make a note in the survey if you'd like it. Tell us where to get it, and we will look forward to sending that to you with all of our love from FreeWill. Other resources. Excuse me. I wrote up a strategy memo right after the election outlining a bunch of these changes. This can be quite helpful internally as you think about changing strategy. We will send this to you in an email if you just drop a note in the survey. So please do that as well. Next week is the last webinar of 2024, and this will be a deep dive into strategic planning for 2025. So first of all, I'm sad this is the last one. It's been a fun year. A lot of ups and downs. The rise of AI, the growth of donor advised funds, the election, the stock market surges, et cetera, right? The evolving great wealth transfer, millennials coming into age as donors, older donors, changing behavior, all sorts of fun stuff. So what does it mean for 2025? We're going to have a fun look at that. Please come. We'll make sure you can raise some bigger gifts there. And on Thursday, if you have a grants program, I would strongly encourage you to come. If you want to have a grants program in 2025, I would strongly encourage you to come. If you don't have either of those things, I would strongly encourage you not to come and do something else with your time. But if you are in one of those two first categories, come join us on Thursday. We're going to show you what I think of as the most astonishingly good technology of 2025 when it comes 2024, excuse me, when it comes into in the nonprofit sector. Again, corporate, government, foundation funding. If any of these are in your wheelhouse, come check out this technology. Grant Assistant is a company that FreeWill acquired because we were so blown away at what it could do for nonprofits and for international development organizations. So come hang out for half an hour on Thursday. I promise you'll be worth your while. If you are interested in more of these smart gifts and technology to support DAFs, stock giving, cryptocurrency, et cetera, make a note in the survey. There's one question you can ask, and we'll have someone give you a one-on-one walkthrough of those gifts. So check that out as well. Ooh, Marianne says, we're getting Grant Assistant. We're excited to deploy it. Marianne, I promise you, I don't have a religious book handy, but if I did, I would swear to you that you are going to find it mind-blowing and love it. So Karen asked, how do you sign up for the Grant Assistant session? The link is in the survey. So just say, yes, I want to come to that, and we will send you a calendar invite. But I promise you, you will be like amazed, overjoyed. If you have a grants program, you'll say, wow, this is the best thing I've seen. Literally in my entire, people that we've showed it to who have grants programs say, I've been doing grants for 25 years. I've never seen anything this great. And some of them cry on the phone because they're just like, this is going to make my life so much better. So check that out. Come see that. And we promise you'll be great. Okay. Last things, fill out the survey. Last webinar of 2024 is next week. Come hang out with me and all of us. If you have creative ideas or anything to share, shoot me an email. Also, one thing that I realized recently is that many of you don't actually know how many people are on the call. We peaked at 1,300 people today. So people are sort of really interested in learning alongside you. Those of you that contributed in the chat with your own anecdotes or your own opinions, super helpful to literally more than 1,000 people. No, 1,300. Brooke says 3,300, 1,300. And it is just an unbelievable joy for me to be able to do this with you. I learn a lot from the questions. I learn a lot from the prep. I am eternally grateful for my colleague Phoebe and the rest of the FreeWill team who puts a lot of work into making these possible. So special thank you to Phoebe and crew. And we will be seeing you next Tuesday. So I'm sure you're going to be winding down the year for some of you. Some of you will be speeding up at the end of your giving, but come hang out December 17th. We'll take a big picture of you on strategy for 2025 because the world is changing. And so navigating it together will be important. So appreciate you all. Sorry we didn't get a chance to get to questions, but I want to make sure everyone gets out by 1 o'clock Eastern. Have a wonderful weekend. Have a wonderful start to your holiday season, and I will see you on Thursday for many of you. So take care, and thank you again.